So, all right, we're recording right now, and let's wait about 20 seconds. All right, it's going 2 seconds. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. This is a new episode of Atlantic Debrief, our show where we bring experts, analysts, reporters, policymakers to comment and analyze European and Atlantic news of the day. I'm very glad today to be joined by Alena Kudzko from Bratislava. Alena is a Belarus national who is the director of the GLOBSEC Policy Institute, a partner of the Atlantic Council. Alena, great to see you today.
Thank you so much, Ben, for the invitation.
So Alena, today we want to talk with you, of course, about the movement we're seeing right now in Belarus following the contested election of yesterday that saw the very much questioned re-election of President dictator Lukashenko. We're seeing massive protest after a campaign that has actually gathered a lot of attention. Before going into what's next and what the EU and the United States should do to support democracy and the rule of law in Belarus, I first want to ask you, why are these elections different this time, you think?
Thank you so much, Ben. It's indeed might be a very unprecedented election, definitely in the history of Belarus. What we have right now is much more politically and socially mobilized society than before. We already had huge rallies during the election campaign, and the people were rallying not for Lukashenko, but for alternative candidates. And we have people who organized to support each other, whether it was fundraising for people who got arrested, or just providing, for example, the food and support for people, for healthcare workers who were helping out with COVID and so on. So it's definitely a very dynamic society who suddenly discovered that it can organize itself without much help from the government, that it can actually organize itself sometimes against the government, and that it can achieve a lot, and that the change is possible. That's why even the song of the elections was the old a song that was done during the Soviet times and was very popular in the 19th, and that was about the changes. So the song about the changes, that we want changes, became the slogan of this campaign. So contrary to this very dynamic society, another element is that the government actually seems to be getting out of tune with the population. Probably for the first time in history, Lukashenko does not have a majority. He does not have a support of the majority of the population. Opinion polls are banned currently, only the governmental ones are allowed, but all the extrapolations point out that he does not enjoy a majority. But it seems like he either refuses to understand it and recognize it, or genuinely is out of touch with the population. That's why the government is overconfident in its capacity and is increasingly out of touch with the vast majority of the people. Old methods simply do not work. The population does not buy the old narrative so much. We do not buy the narratives of island of stability and foreign interference. And simply people find the current atmosphere in the country stale and demanding something a bit more modern and something that can deliver better.
Yeah, and so you're talking about a dynamic society, and that's something that's been really striking, I think, for all of us in the last few weeks. We've seen this campaign that has been led by 3 women. I want you to tell us a little bit more about this. Activists that have been very present on social media, on messenger apps. So tell us a little bit about the atmosphere of this campaign, and especially the women that have led it.
The whole campaign was very spontaneous, and even the famous saying about the main candidate from the opposition, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, is that she's an accidental candidate. She never really wanted to run for the elections. She ended up feeling obliged in a way to do so after her husband, who wanted to run, got arrested, and after 2 main candidates were disqualified from running in the elections. One was put in jail, and the other one had to flee the country fearing persecution and imprisonment. So she had no other choice in a way but to take responsibility on her shoulders. And the story goes that that's actually how women feel in Belarusian society. When men cannot deliver, we have to stand up and do it. So she in a way symbolizes this hidden power of women. But what is interesting, she didn't actually run on the campaign of feminism in the way it's often portrayed in the West. It wasn't the main message of the campaign that women, we're strong, we need to have more rights, we can do it. It was a subtle message for sure, and people got it, but they never openly said that we're campaigning for women's rights. In a way, this campaign was also unique because there was this unifying feeling of solidarity. It doesn't matter who you are, either you are a man or a woman, whether you're old or young, we're all together in it. So in a way, she became this face of the campaign together with two other women who represented the united opposition. Of course, it looks wonderful on the pictures, and that's a very powerful message. In a way, even probably the Belarusian society is still not ready for this strong feminist narrative in this pure form. And but it was still appealing for a wide electorate. For example, the main candidate, what she was saying is actually, I would be happy to be at home and cook my cutlets in the kitchen, but I have no other choice but participate in political life of the society. And this is something that resonates very well with the population as well, because there is no time for us to sit at home and do whatever we want to do at home, but everybody has no other choice but try to defend their rights. That's not the women issue. Definitely social media was another very crucial component in this campaign, and I'm talking about social media, not just necessarily Facebook or the Russian version of Kontakte or Odnoklassniki. I'm also talking about YouTube. It was YouTube bloggers who in a way started this very popular rallies, and they had very catchy slogans in the best styles of social media. For example, "Stop the Cockroach" came from YouTube bloggers, and it was very catchy thing that people picked up very quickly. But also, especially before, but especially during the election day and election night, the messengers became a very crucial source of information. Messengers were already very important because in a way it's unfiltered information that can reach huge amounts of people. But what happened yesterday and overnight, the internet was pretty much cut off in the country. All the more or less independent news websites were inaccessible. Of course, the coordination became close to impossible. So the messengers were the only way to pass the information, also for journalists to pass the information to citizens, but also in some way to coordinate what's going on in the country. And this is another aspect that the government overlooked, and another illustration of this division between old methods and modernity, because the government never really embraced the power of the social media. State television and state newspapers are still the main channel of communication with the electorate. So this huge segments that majority of the modern population is using as a source of information was pretty much totally in the hands of the opposition or alternative candidates.
Yeah. So this election is historic because you have this dynamic society that is rising against what is often called the last dictatorship of Europe. It's also geopolitically significant because we've seen the United States and the EU get closer to Belarus in the last couple of years and see it in a way as a sort of buffer against Russia. And Putin, on the other hand, trying to keep Belarus as close as possible. Some people had even suggested a form of union between the two countries, which could be a scenario for Putin to continue his rule beyond his term as president. What comes next for Belarus? What do you think should be the reaction of the European Union and the United States? And should we fear a Russian reaction like we saw in Ukraine in 2014?
There are several elements that are very interesting for me here. First is that we're now discussing, especially being in Europe or in the US, we're discussing these elections primarily in geopolitical lenses. For people inside the countries, geopolitics were rather secondary in these elections. It was mostly about domestic issues. And it wasn't pro-EU or pro-Russia. There was no such choice as it was, for example, in Ukraine during Maidan. It was more about mobilization of people against the stale regime that no longer delivers. So there's this discrepancy of narratives within the country and outside of the country. But that said, of course, the government really tried in a way to make it a geopolitical elections. There was a lot of fear mongering, not just about the West, as it's always happened before, but this time also against Russia. Definitely that didn't sell very well because Belarusians are not really that afraid of Russia. We've always been friends, brothers, and that was the predominant narrative that the government was offering to the population. So it's very different within the course of a few weeks to change the minds of the population and suddenly portray somebody as an element. The European Union and the United States were not that visible during the elections at all. And in a way, it's potentially good and bad. Good part of it is that Belarusians didn't really expect the European Union or the US to come and save the day. Nobody was chanting for the EU to do something. There were no public calls. People were relying on their own forces, which is in a way a good dynamic for the country that is genuinely on the course of change. Of course, the bad thing is that probably some people are somewhat disappointed with what's been this rapprochement between the EU and Belarus, or US and Belarus, is all about. A lot of people are genuinely disappointed that there have been no sanctions, especially on Lukashenko as a person and the people who are close to him, who are responsible for repressions in the country. Lots of people just don't find it that attractive in terms of the geopolitical orientation. Yeah, people want to be friends, but not necessarily join the European Union. So this also probably highlights that it's not such a hell-bent society that we want to be part of the EU at all costs. It's a different narrative. Coming to what can be done, I do think that some kind of sanctions will be very important, at least symbolically, to maintain some credibility of the European Union and the United States, but also show to the population that yeah, the world sees what's going on and it's not going to save the country, but that's an important symbol of solidarity. And I'm talking about sanctions, personal sanctions on the people responsible, not necessarily sanctions on the country or the carpet sanctions on the trade and so on. Another important element here would be to, since we have this opening towards more modernity in the country, let's put it this way, we have a huge segment of population that wants to have better education, better trade relations, better governance. And even though we don't articulate it in this way, these are European values, these are American values. So it is important to continue working with this segment of population, which apparently now is a majority actually, to continue proven that this is something that can work in Belarus. I'm talking here, of course, about economic relations, educational exchanges, and so on. An important factor is visa. The EU has already made the important step of trying to liberalize the visas. They're much cheaper now, but I would go as far as having the visa-free regime for Belarusians as well.
All right, so sanctions against the political leadership, support for the civil society and cultural exchanges, and visa liberalization. I think that's really concrete. We're speaking and right now as repression is underway against the opposition. So obviously we're going to follow this very closely. I hope that your family and friends in Belarus also will be safe. Alena Kudzko, Director at the GLOBSEC Policy Institute, thank you very much for joining us. We'll continue obviously monitoring the situation very closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you everybody for listening.